Welcome and thank you for joining tonight's webinar on how to reverse type 2 diabetes. My name is Camilla Dahl and I'm an accredited practicing dietitian here at Diversus Health. Tonight's session will run for about an hour, so we won't take up too much of your evening. There will be a chance to ask questions and we really encourage it. So on your screens, you should see a chat box. So if you have any questions or comments, please put them in there. And I should also let you know that this evening's webinar will also be recorded. We've also got our health coach, Susie, joining us, and she'll gather up all the questions at the end and we'll have an opportunity to go through them. The good news is that we'll also be running these webinars again. So if you enjoyed it or missed some of the content or have a family member, loved one or friend that might like to join, there will be a chance to attend another one, and you can check out when the upcoming webinars are by visiting our website, diversahealth.com. So now I'd like to introduce you to our co-founder and GP, Dr. Robert Szabo, who will start us off by talking about how he evolved from the low-carb clinic into Diversa Health and his own personal journey with diabetes. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks very much, Camilla. Welcome to everybody and thank you for joining us. And so this tonight is a topic that's very dear to my heart. And as Camilla was saying, we've transitioned from what used to be the low carb clinic into a clinic that's now called Diversa Health. And Diversa is a play on words of diabetes reversal. So we've decided to really focus on that just because of the growing burden of diabetes in Australia and also all of the other extra illnesses that diabetes can actually trigger and lead to. And us coming to this point has really been a 5+ year journey, and that all began, well, actually it was about 7 or 8 years ago now, when I had my own personal health journey with my own diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, which I must say was quite devastating at the time. And I was only 37 at the time and thought I was really healthy and thought I was doing all the right things and felt great, and actually just had an insurance medical and found that I had full-blown diabetes, which was quite a shock. And that led to me having to pick up the pieces from that diagnosis and try and build my health back in a way, but in a way which puzzled me because I thought I was already doing the right things. Then about a year into that, I discovered through a friend who had been to a low carb meeting that doctors had actually been successfully reversing type 2 diabetes with some of their patients using a low carb approach. And I mean, it took me a few hours to then go and research this as soon as I got home, and decided to give it a go on myself, and found that lo and behold, it worked incredibly well. And really pretty much from day one, like I had a dramatic improvement, and that's something that I'd never been taught. So I suddenly found something very powerful that was new to me as an experienced doctor, having practiced, not only gone through my training, but then having actually practiced for probably about 10 years at that time, or more. And so it's just led me down the rabbit hole and through a journey of learning. And I'm very grateful to have actually had that experience now, because it's taught me a lot more about how to be healthy. Having had that experience, I then decided that, look, I couldn't really keep this from my patients, and decided to offer it to them as an option, and found that those that took it up had, by and large, similarly, really, really profoundly positive results. And that's how it grew. And so 5 years ago, I decided to open a clinic that was just purposefully for the intention of helping people who've got type 2 diabetes, and also related conditions, things like weight, polycystic ovarian syndrome, to reverse or at least improve their conditions. And that's really how the low carb clinic then began. Most of our time, we've been a traditional clinic in the sense that, there's an office, you go and make a booking, you turn up in the waiting room and get called in, and then you go. And that's been for the majority of the time of that clinic. And it's only really in the last year that we've decided to switch to a remote care model, which is how we run things at the clinic now. And that's through telehealth. So we predominantly run through Zoom and video conferencing. Now, the benefit of that is that you don't need to spend, half a day getting it off work, driving through traffic, and then waiting in a waiting room, and then, you know, all the argy-bargy. You can actually just have it. You can have your consultation from anywhere around Australia. And yeah, that's been really great that we're able to help people wherever they are in a much more convenient way. And the other thing that we found that was a pretty consistent sort of feedback back when we were just doing individual consultations was that people often didn't have enough support by having a single consultation and then just going home and trying to implement everything that we'd said without having a touch point to be able to come back and get that guidance on a more regular basis. And so listening to that, we've decided to change the way that we provide our clinical care, and now provide kind of ongoing support. And the difference that's occurred as a result is that instead of people coming in and just having one consultation and just paying for one consultation, we now have a subscription that's done in monthly chunks, with the initial being a minimum of 3 months, just to kind of really get, you know, bed down the initial changes. And there's been some good feedback in the sense that people feel a lot more supported, and they can contact us as often as they like, so that, you know, for what can be for some people a really difficult thing to implement in their family life and their social life, we can help them navigate that and make it work. But that does take, you know, some fine tuning and some advice. So those have been the kind of the couple of things that have recently evolved in the last year to, as we've transitioned to Diversa, we're now providing this kind of a remote care subscription type service. I'm just going to briefly talk to you a little bit about diabetes. And in this diagram, you can see three well, pancreas as they are, the yellow thing on the left. And the pancreas is what makes insulin. And I'm just going to explain to you briefly what normal is, then what type 1 diabetes is, and what type 2 diabetes is. And the top row going from left to right is normal. So the pancreas makes insulin, which is that little blue circle. Insulin is what then allows glucose to enter the cell. So you can see the little dot is the glucose, and the insulin sticks to the receptor on that cell on the right. And insulin's like a key that opens a lock that allows the glucose in. All right, so without the insulin, the glucose can't enter the cell. It's stuck in the circulation. And it's really critical that we always have some insulin. We can't be alive without it. In type 1 diabetes, you can see that red cross in the middle. The pancreas actually just stops making insulin, and that's due to an attack on the pancreas. It's an autoimmune, so your body's actually making antibodies. It's like an immune response against the pancreas, which is the problem. And you don't make any insulin, and then the glucose is stuck outside the cell, and you need to inject insulin for the rest of your life with type 1 diabetes, because you can't be alive without insulin. Now, whilst type 1 diabetes can be managed incredibly well using a low-carb approach, it's predominantly it's not reversible. So once you've got type 1 diabetes, that's for life, and you need to keep on replacing insulin, because you're not making any. In type 2 diabetes, it's a very different situation. And type 2 diabetes is what's called insulin resistance. And as you can see down the bottom, there's lots of insulin, those blue circles, which is the insulin. There's lots and lots of insulin initially being made, but the cell is just not responding to it. So you can see the little red cross on the cell where it says insulin receptor, and that's just the fact that the cell is insulin resistant. So there's plenty of insulin, but it's just that the cell's actually not, it's like it's immune to the insulin, right? And so the glucose is actually stuck outside the cell, and in response to that, your pancreas makes more. Now, eventually you can overcome the resistance. So you've got a certain degree of insulin resistance. If you can make more concentration of insulin, then you'll be able to make that work, and the glucose will enter the cell. But you know, as happens in type 2 diabetes, you start to kind of max out with how much insulin you can make. You know, there's a limit to how much you can make, and when you hit that limit, that's when your blood sugar's out of control, right? So initially you are making more than you should, and it works. You're able to keep that blood sugar normal, but then eventually you max out and you can't do that anymore. And at that stage, the pancreas is actually starting to conk out a little bit too, because it's actually been made to work very, very hard for usually quite a few years. And, it's like revving the hell out of your car. The engine just doesn't last as long. And so you actually start to get a decline in insulin production at the same time. If that's early enough, there is actually some scope where you can repair some pancreatic function and actually increase insulin production to get your blood sugar down again. And the problems with diabetes are just go on and on and on. I remember when I was at uni, I always said to myself, it was the one disease I didn't want to have, because I knew that diabetes is not one disease, it's 1,000 diseases. And just about anything that can go wrong is made much more likely with diabetes. And so in this diagram, it shows how it can lead to blindness, and it can lead to stroke and to kidney failure and dialysis and heart attack and ulcers and amputations. It's really not a fun thing. So the concept that it potentially can be improved and in many cases reversed is pretty exciting, because like I say, you not only potentially prevent having diabetes, but you also prevent having all of these conditions too. And diabetes was and continues to be taught to doctors as a one-way street. This was actually a drug company brochure that I got in my pigeonhole at work when I was at the GP about probably 5 or 6 years ago now. And as you can see, the progression is that you start with diet and exercise, and then you work to metformin, which is the medication that people are usually put on at first. And then you add a second medication, a second tablet, and then maybe a third tablet, and then you end up with an injectable. And that's kind of just, how it's been taught, that it's an inevitability that you're going to end up traveling down this road, and that the earlier you get diabetes, the more likely you are to end up down the very right-hand side. But in actual fact, there are 3 well-described ways that you can reverse diabetes. Those 3 ways are bariatric surgery, so surgery which is cutting out part of the stomach. Pretty radical stuff, but it works. It's highly effective, and people that have type 2 diabetes, when they have this surgery, have a very high rate of going into remission of diabetes within a week or 2. So even before they've lost much weight, their blood sugar levels just plummet. The second way is using very low calorie diets. So basically that's going on a really kind of a crash, like 800 calories, or very, very, very limited dietary intake for maybe 2 to 3 months. It sort of varies as to what's recommended, which is also been studied quite extensively and has been shown to work. The problem with very low calorie diets is that many of the studies have shown that there's rebound. So in the years subsequent to people then going off that very low calorie period, in many instances, diabetes comes back. And then the third option, which, as you might guess, is my favorite, is low carbohydrate diets. And the beauty that I find with low carbohydrate diets is that low carbohydrate doesn't have the problems that are associated with the first 2. So bariatric surgery, although very effective, has many surgical complications. Many things can go wrong, including death. And there's also, I suppose, like a bit of a philosophical thing whereby you've got a dietary disease and you're trying to apply a surgical solution. Whilst that could be the right thing for that person, I also worry that whatever has led that particular person to diabetes is probably still happening to their family members. Maybe their partner, their children, their household is still in that kind of dietary pattern. Are we just going to sign up the kids too? Is that just an inevitability? And maybe the answer is yes, but I think providing options of things like the other 2 would be a good idea. I think that we shouldn't just leave this to be an inevitability that everyone's going to have part of their stomach cut out. So, yeah, you're lacking the surgical complications with a low carbohydrate diet. And it's something which we're often told isn't sustainable, but actually us in this clinic, we find that in many patients, it's very sustainable. And the reason being, it's really satisfying. You know, we encourage people to be full and to eat as much as they feel like they need to, and to not restrict. And for many people, for I would say most of the people that we see, that is liberation. You know, these people have often been restricting their whole life, thinking that they need to stay hungry in order to be healthy. And to suddenly be told that actually I want you to walk away full is just often quite emotional for these people. And so that's why I think low carbohydrate diets are particularly sustainable. You get very satisfied by your meals. And really, there's not many diets that can claim that. So we find that it works incredibly well. Now, it's not for everyone, and that's absolutely fair and valid. And I don't think it's right for us to tell anybody what to do. I think our role is to provide options and to kind of empower people to make the decision that's right for them. So this is data that came from a Verta Health trial. This is the 12-month data, and it's pretty impressive. So you can see that even it measured HbA1c. So the numbers that you can see there, the 7.6 going down to the 6.5 and 6.4, that's a marker called HbA1c. HbA1c is how we measure the severity of diabetes. And in these people who are on a low carbohydrate diet, they had a reduction in HbA1c pretty quickly. So even within the 3-month period, they went from an average of 7.6 down to 6.5 and 6.4 at 12 months. And 6.5 is the threshold for the diagnosis of diabetes. Now, there would have been quite a few people within that group that were still above 6.5, but it was a pretty impressive result, particularly considering that many of these patients actually not only reversed their diabetes, but also did so by stopping medications. That's pretty powerful. And so coming back to that diagram, the drug company material that was in my pigeonhole, really what we need to do is open up a second lane. And now you can see down the bottom, there's an arrow going in the other direction that's going backwards. So I think we need to view diabetes not as a one-way street, but as a two-way street. And really, it can go in either direction. People can get worse, people can get better. How much better? Can we go all the way back to no diabetes? Yes, in many people, not in everyone. It just depends on at what point down the road do you throw that U-turn? How far down the road are you? And how much are you prepared to, shake up your diet? And this is really where I guess we kind of come in, because we can individualize and tailor the way we approach each person based on preferences, based on emotional eating and the need to actually soothe ourselves, many times every day of our lives. And how do you achieve that? And what are your other options? So there are many factors that come into this, and this is where we kind of take that individualized approach. But certainly I think this is the concept that, we need to now be aware of, and that all doctors really need to be aware of, that diabetes is not a progressive condition. It only is if you maintain the things that cause it, which is sugar, high starch in many people, and probably vegetable oils. But if you remove the cause, you actually have the potential to actually allow the body to heal itself. So I'm going to pass over to Camilla now, and she'll continue the second part of the talk.
Thanks so much, Rob. So what's really fascinating to me is that in the whole human body, obviously depends on how big or small you are, on average, there is only 1 teaspoon of sugar, which is your blood glucose. When you think about it, that's surprisingly a small amount. Because of the word blood sugar, many believe that sugar is the enemy of diabetes. And while it definitely is, it's not the only one. All carbohydrates are composed of sugar and it's hidden throughout our food supply. Bread, pasta, potato, and cereal, for example, are just chains of sugar linked to sugar. So you can call it a Mars bar or you can call it quinoa. It's all just your own blood sugar. No matter the source, a glucose molecule is a glucose molecule. There is chemically no difference, and the glucose that you will eat will end up in your bloodstream and raise your own. So while we need that 1 teaspoon of glucose or sugar in the blood, we don't need to eat glucose to actually make that glucose. We can make it from protein and fat, and this is done by a process called gluconeogenesis that happens in the liver. So all foods are made up of three broad categories known as macronutrients, major nutrients. You might have also called them macros at one stage. They are carbohydrate, protein, and fat. So many foods are a combination of two or all three of these macronutrients. But really, when you nail it down, our bodies are only really made out of two, and they are protein and fat, which is why they are essential. So, in other words, we've got to eat it or we'll die to replace what we're turning over. So, your body must have it because it can't make it itself. Carbs are not essential. They are actually an optional part of the diet. We don't need them to survive as our bodies aren't made of carbs, which is why there's no such thing as a carbohydrate deficiency syndrome. It simply doesn't exist. And I always like to pull up this table so we can really sort of nail down the functions of each of these macronutrients in the body. So you can see that fat and protein do many things. Carbohydrates, that column's looking pretty blank. They don't do very much in the body at all, actually, nothing. Unfortunately, our modern diet revolves around carbohydrates, healthy whole grains, and sugar. In fact, it is suggested by major guidelines that over half of our calories, over half of our food actually come from carbohydrates. And assumption that because there is glucose in the blood, that glucose is the normal and preferred fuel for the body. This is not true, not for any adult or any child. So many things can cause high blood sugar, but really it's food that is the biggest. When we eat carbohydrates, our body converts these carbohydrates into glucose and raises blood sugar. Protein to a certain degree, and you can see that on the screen, and fat doesn't raise blood sugar levels at all. Stress leading to an increase in a hormone called cortisol can also raise blood sugar levels. So, when you have someone who has type 2 diabetes and difficulty controlling their high blood glucose, the solution becomes pretty bloody obvious. If we have too much glucose in the body, stop eating it. As Robert was talking about previously, don't use medications to hide it away where you can't see it. When you eat carbs, I like to think of it about being on a rocky roller coaster ride. So take a minute, imagine a breakfast of oats, a wrap for lunch, maybe a banana for afternoon tea, whole grain pasta, some low fat yogurt. At each meal, a bucket load of insulin needs to be released inside your body. Each time you eat carbs, that's where those arrows are on the screen. High glucose, leads to levels of lethargy, feeling tired, and high insulin levels lead to increased hunger and weight gain. This roller coaster is definitely not a ride that I would want to be on. But it can change. It doesn't have to be like this. When you don't eat carbs, it's a much more stable situation. And it's really interesting. You can actually see this with a continuous glucose monitor, not just within people who have diabetes, but actually in everyday people with normal HbA1c levels. And you can imagine this is a much more calmer state for the body to be in. So now imagine a breakfast of eggs, lunch, maybe some fish and salad, a snack of cheese, and that's full fat cheese too. Dinner, being a T-bone steak with the fat on the side, with maybe some mushroom sauce. And for dessert, berries and cream. Wow, sounds pretty delicious to me, and that makes a huge difference in terms of that roller coaster ride that we just looked at the previous screen. And interestingly, very few people need to eat that much. Very few people snack or even have 3 meals a day once they've switched over to low carb. And it's not even something I have to tell them to do. They're just naturally so full and satisfied with the food they, can't sort of take another snack or meal in sometimes. And, this is really fascinating. It was talking about, the hidden sugar in foods. And I think this slide really highlights some of that. You probably wouldn't have 15 teaspoons of sugar, straight up for breakfast. But if you have something like a small serve of Nutri-Grain, only about 40 grams, a banana, and some low-fat yogurt, you're probably there, and hey, you haven't even added milk in there yet. So maybe it's not such a great idea to have a heart-healthy cereal for breakfast. Many people speak about having breads that are low GI or healthier options like sourdough, but actually, that's still equivalent to 4 teaspoons of sugar to your body. So if you have diabetes, think about it as being carbohydrate allergic or carbohydrate intolerant. Like other food intolerances, the most logical and effective approach to managing carbohydrate intolerance is to restrict sugars and carbs to within your metabolic tolerance. So, if you like peanuts but had a severe allergy, would you eat them but then inject yourself with an EpiPen to cover the effects? It's the same with diabetes. Would you eat the carbs or carbohydrates and inject the insulin? Or just not eat the carbohydrates and not have to inject the antidote? Everyone is different. We are all different biochemically. Somebody who has a high waist circumference, maybe it's over 80 centimeters for females, over 90 for males, gaining weight easily and has type 2 diabetes and feels tired, they would be a good candidate for a lower carb approach versus someone who can maintain their weight with ease and has good energy throughout the day. Of course, carbohydrate tolerance can change over time, and we sort of see that as well. We, adjust things in terms of the diet. It evolves what you eat when you first start low carb versus in the middle, perhaps in a couple of years, looks very different because carbohydrate tolerance can change over time. But I think it's really important to experiment and to listen to how your body feels and to eat to that. So these are just some of the delicious foods that reverse diabetes, that don't raise blood sugar, as all of these things break down to 1 teaspoon or less. So the really, really exciting thing I think is that actually type 2 diabetes reversal starts after the first meal because blood glucose improves straight away. It's amazing to see. Not only that, but substantial weight loss and health markers improve often follow. People feel better and have more energy, alertness, and metabolic health is restored. Imagine that, eating to hunger, no calorie counting, no weighing, no measuring. There is no vitamin mineral deficiency in starchy foods that can't be found in these foods that you see on your screen, all of the low carb foods. And speaking of vitamins and minerals, avoid these foods because, hey, most of these are fortified, believe it or not. So, in other words, these foods like bread are actually so nutrient poor that the government has deliberately had to increase the content of micronutrients by adding them artificially. Because if you ate these foods just alone, you would suffer illness. That's pretty incredible, I think. Sadly, low-fat products like skim milk have vitamins added, so vitamin A and D fortified, which are both fat soluble. So even if you're having those things, like say a person is consuming skim milk, in the absence of having fats in your diet, you may not be able to absorb much of these vitamins at all. So, of course, these foods have other things in there, like B vitamins and fiber. But if you have type 2 diabetes or some insulin resistance, hey, that glucose effect, those teaspoons of sugar that are coming in are way more important because um, they, start that roller coaster ride that we were looking at before. So have a think. How much do these foods mean to your life? Could you give them up if it meant that you didn't have type 2 diabetes anymore? So you may have heard some challenging information, and that's okay. Is now the right time to start? Are you ready to give up some of those foods that you probably had in your diet for decades, probably for as long as you can remember? Will people around you support you on your journey, or will you be alone? Perhaps we, might be your only supports. What will your diabetes look like in 10, 20 years from now? What would you say to yourself now? So if you think that we might be the right fit for you, we offer an Australian-wide service remotely. We've developed unique priority and ultimate subscription membership plans, both with personalized one-to-one coaching, medical monitoring, and I think the most important thing is that support element. You may also be eligible for rebates on these plans if you have private health insurance with dietetics extras. We're also really excited to announce we've made it easier for our members to connect with us, as well as video calls, which are on at the moment, and email. We're now enabling SMS, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, or live chat. So we're there for you in between appointments. We're also excited to announce the launch of My Diversa. So that's our exclusive members portal where you can obtain pathology reports and other support materials specifically selected for you. And you can view and change appointments online. So whether that's a quick word of encouragement, some support if things are looking a bit rocky, or advice on some product or some recipe ideas, hey, we're here for you. And anyone can see us, so there's no referral required. And you can check out our website, diversahealth.com.au, for more information as well. So that now sort of brings us to the main part of the presentation. But hey, don't go away. I thought that perhaps we could go through some questions that have been flowing in. Susie, hi. You've been gathering up the questions. I'd be interested to hear what some of them are, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Yeah, I certainly have. Thanks, Camilla and Rob. That was a great and very informative, so thank you very much. If anyone wants to add any more questions into the chat just while we're answering some, feel free to pop them in there. But some of the questions that were asked during the discussion that have come up, Rob, this one's probably for you. I have high cholesterol. Can I still do this diet? Won't it increase?
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, that's a question that we get asked a lot, and the answer is that the cholesterol effect of cutting out carbohydrates, which is really what we're saying, varies, and it can even fluctuate a bit. It varies from person to person. In some people, cholesterol levels go up. In other people, they stay the same, and in other people, they actually go down. So there's no universal way that people respond to a low-carb diet. And that's part of the monitoring that we do as well. Probably the most important thing to say about the topic of cholesterol is that it's not as simple as just worrying about your cholesterol. There's the main issue that's actually been found to be the risk as far as cardiovascular disease goes is actually diabetes. By far and away, if you can reverse diabetes, that is going to be the biggest impact that you can have to reducing your risk of having a heart attack. It's kind of like, order of magnitude or two bigger than cholesterol. And so, I guess we need to kind of weigh those things up. The other part of it is that what has been found is people who have a low triglyceride, which is part of the cholesterol panel. When you get your cholesterol done, one of the things that comes through on that list is triglyceride. And if your triglyceride comes down and you have a low triglyceride, which is actually what happens on a low carbohydrate diet pretty reliably, then what we've found is that in people who have got a low triglyceride, cholesterol actually doesn't become a risk factor. So we've got huge sets of data where we found with tens of thousands of people, what we know is that actually cholesterol is only a risk factor in those that have a high triglyceride. So you almost think, well, what's the point of worrying about cholesterol? Why not just bring the triglyceride down? And then we actually know it's not going to be an issue. So for all of those reasons, I think that, look, there's a big profit motive here. You know, we have pills that can lower cholesterol. And so it's kind of in the interest of these multinational manufacturers for doctors and patients to be really, really worried about cholesterol. The reality is that it's probably really, really overstated. And what's understated is the risk of diabetes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rob, for answering that question. Camilla, I've got one for you. Can I drink alcohol on a low-carb diet?
Yeah, really great question, and one that I get all the time. And interestingly, things like pure spirits are actually zero carbs. But just because something's zero carbs doesn't necessarily mean it's good for you, because alcohol kind of acts as its own separate, macronutrient. So we have fat, protein, and carbs. But alcohol does something very different in the body. It's a poison or a toxin, believe it or not. So when you have alcohol, the liver has to stop doing everything else that it's doing and really prioritize it. So it puts fat burning on hold. And in sort of doing so, if you have a diabetes and perhaps wearing a continuous glucose monitor, you'll actually see if you drink alcohol on a low carb diet, your glucose will come down because it blocks a hormone called glucagon. And so what people find, the more alcohol that they drink, perhaps the more hungry that they get. They also notice that their inhibitions are much lower. So after a few drinks, those carbs are looking, pretty good, as are, other snacks as well. So while, on a low carb diet, you can absolutely, enjoy a drink or two, especially on, special occasions, maybe on the weekend. The best options are spirits, maybe with a diet mixer, dry wine, so something like red wine or white wine, champagne, but avoiding things like cocktails and things with lots of sugar in them. I like to refer to beer as liquid bread. So a standard beer has around 15 grams of carbs in there, which is essentially a sandwich. And so what we like to do is, figure out, some different alternatives. So, something like beer is something that you enjoy. We've got some zero carb beer options that we can sort of substitute. But while you can absolutely enjoy alcohol on low carb, I think, the best results come from abstaining and choosing something like water or sparkling mineral water as the drink of choice most of the time. Thanks, Susie.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Camilla. Probably another one for you. What about intermittent fasting? Should I be worried about low blood sugars while I'm intermittent fasting?
Yeah, it's actually a really common theme. A lot of people are concerned about low blood glucose readings. And generally speaking, you don't have to be worried as long as you feel fine. And the most important thing is that you're not injecting any insulin. What's really interesting is that I generally see that blood sugars are slightly lower than normal on a low carb diet, especially when you're in a state of nutritional ketosis. So basically, what that means is that your body is no longer using carbohydrates and glucose for energy. This metabolic, switch has, flipped, and then all of a sudden you start burning, fat, your own body fat, and that can be measured in the blood, through sort of ketones. So your body doesn't need to rely on glucose as energy anymore. And in this situation, the brain really thrives on ketones for fuel. So you don't have that same need for glucose in your bloodstream. So if you feel really great and, if you're not eating, you're fasting, you probably have all the blood, sugar that your body needs. Of course, you know, the number one rule with fasting is that if you're not feeling well, you should stop fasting. You know, you can always start fasting at another time and, you know, break that fast. And of course, if you're on any medication, insulin in particular, there are certain other diabetes medications that are also contraindicated on a low carb diet and fasting. Generally speaking, hey, that's a really great sign that your body's, you know, in a state of nutritional ketosis, and that actually that low blood sugar, you know, is just what your body is adapted to. Especially, yeah, you're feeling fine, you don't get any symptoms.
I might add a bit to that. Thanks, Camilla.
Yep.
Just in terms of medications, I think that's the thing that we really need to be kind of safe about. And so certainly insulin, like you pointed out, that can be an issue when someone's trying to fast. If they're on insulin, then we need to be very, very careful in monitoring that very closely. And there's also a category of medication called sulfonylureas. And sulfonylureas make your pancreas secrete more insulin itself. So they basically put your own body's insulin up. And it depends where you're at with your blood sugar levels and that medication. It just basically needs to be monitored. So I think my answer to that is it needs medical review if people are on any medications at all. If they're not on medications, and some medications are fine to fast on, but others are not. And so it really needs to be reviewed so that it can be done safely. And look, fasting is fantastic in terms of it's a very, very effective way at accelerating the reversal of diabetes. So I really, you know, encourage people to, well, actually what I like to think about is feasting. You know, I like to talk about intermittent feasting I think why focus on deprivation when you can focus on the good thing that's coming? And it's very, very powerful, but the proviso is that it needs to be medically monitored, and it also needs some close monitoring on the part of your blood sugar levels if you're on medications.
Excellent. While we're on that, the other question that came through was what other medications do I need to be careful of when starting low carb? So it sort of ties into that question.
Yeah. Well, there's another big category that we like to stop, which is called the SGLT2 inhibitors, and they have got the potential side effect of ketoacidosis. So the drug itself can do that, and so that's not a good idea on a low carbohydrate diet. But basically, there are so many diabetic medications, both oral and injectable, that I don't think it's really kind of the right place for us here to go through all of them. But I guess suffice it to say that there are some that people shouldn't be taking on a low carbohydrate diet. And there's others that they can take but will need to be weaned and need to be monitored very closely. So the nuance of all that is something that should be discussed with a doctor.
Excellent. All right. Is it safe for my family to eat low carb too, so I don't have to cook 2 meals?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I think if the family is doing it as well, hey, your chances of, you know, succeeding and, you know, reaching your health goals and reversing your diabetes just skyrocket. And actually, we've just recently introduced family sessions and friend sessions for our members, because we actually think that that's really important that, you know, you've got the family on board, and, you know, we teach your family, you know, practical, you know, tips and products, and how to incorporate it, you know, not just at home, but hey, if the family's traveling or going out at the restaurant, having everyone on board can absolutely, you know, make a difference. And you know, whether it's a child, you know, or an adult, I just see people thrive on low carb. Children are a little bit different to adults. They don't have the metabolic damage over decades of a diet of, you know, perhaps high sugar, you know, high carbs. So they can have, you know, perhaps a bit more bread, you know, some more fruit, and eat more regularly. I wouldn't recommend you fasting for kids necessarily, or, you know, teenagers who are going through, you know, growth spurts. But they can absolutely, eat low carb. There's no essential carbohydrate for children. There's no essential carbohydrates, for, adults. And, it's really just a diet of, fish, chicken, steak, lamb, eggs, green leafy, vegetables. How can that be, something that the family doesn't enjoy? And there's lots of fun ways to incorporate it, too. So instead, an example would be, instead of pasta, things like zucchini noodles, instead of pizza, like fathead pizza. And I actually think it's a more delicious option, when I think about, something like pizza. I reckon the yummy part is like the toppings, like, the cheese and salami, and the olives. That's the yummy part. I mean, if you had a pizza and just like ate the base, pretty ordinary. So this way is fun. You get to eat the yummy toppings off of things, and I think the family will find it really fun too. But I also think it's important that the family kind of understand what you're doing and why that you're doing it. It's not just a diet. It's this lifestyle, and you're trying to reverse the insulin resistance, that there's some really good hormonal reasons why you're doing this. It's not just about weight loss or going on a diet, that actually it's this lifestyle option. And I think educating the family, as well as showing them how fun and delicious and really easy it can be as well. Rob, did you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think that's perfect. I
Oh,
think,
awesome.
yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I think it's fantastic how you've put that, because it's definitely gonna, yeah, the rates of success that we see are much higher when you get buy-in from the rest of the family. And it doesn't mean that everybody needs to be strictly low carb, but everybody kind of needs to be kind of respectful, or it helps for everybody to be respectful of the needs of the person who's got diabetes, to try and make it as easy for them as possible. Like if you're giving up something else that's addictive, let's just say someone's trying to give up smoking, it doesn't help to have smokes lying around everywhere. So the reality is that carbohydrate foods are very addictive. People tend to not be addicted to steak or eggs. They tend to be addicted to buns and bread and fruit and sweets and lollies and cakes. So these are the things that are addictive. They are addictive. And it definitely helps to have those things not lying around. So not that it can't be done. If somebody's really willing to improve their health, they can still take on a low carbohydrate diet, even if the rest of the family is not doing it. But the chances of success, we tend to find, are higher when there's more support from inside the household.
Great, thanks, Rob and Camilla. I've only got about 2 more questions. Can I have a cheat day?
Yeah, this is one that I think a lot of people ask. I see that if you have, diabetes, that your body knows if you change your diet. So your body knows that, you cheat. A lot of people say that if they have some carbohydrates, that they notice the fluid that comes back on, they feel more puffy and bloated. They know that they feel more hungry as well, that they find that those cravings, come back, that, that the bread that they might have, or the pizza or the pasta, that, the next day that they're looking for those things, again. And so life isn't, perfect, and diet isn't perfect. And unfortunately, we live in a very carby, world. But I think it's really up to the individual to, experiment and, see what works, for them. But I think as long as, you're aware of those effects and kind of eat to your metabolic, tolerance, I wouldn't call it a cheat day, necessarily. I don't think, you sort of cheat on yourself, or, cheat on your hormones. But I think use it as an experiment. If there's a day that, you decide to have some carbohydrates, and, see what happens. Yeah.
Excellent. All
Yeah.
right. Well, sorry, Rob.
I was just gonna say I agree. And the other thing that you can check on with the experiment is that you can check your blood sugars. You know, so when you're low carb, get to know what your blood sugars are, and then if you do have a high carb meal, go and check your blood sugars and see what happens, just so that you have awareness, so that you know what's going on the inside, because ultimately that'll just sort of inform you that, you know, should you stick to this low carb, or should you just relax it and have carbs, you know, every second day? Well, go and check your blood sugars and you'll know, you know. And what we tend to find is that blood sugars tend to go up when people eat the carbohydrates pretty quickly. The other thing that people notice often is like a hangover effect. So unfortunately, people, feel a bit tired for about a day or two. Look, only if you do have some carby food, it tends to be that your body kind of recovers after maybe about a day or two after not eating that, not continuing to eat carbs. So you go back into kind of that fat burning, low carb mode that your body's in. So it's not the end of the world. And I think, again, you know, like, I don't think it's right for us to tell people what they should or shouldn't do. I think it's probably not a bad thing when someone's been low carb for a while to then have some carbs and see what happens. You know, I think it's all learning, and we want to learn about what's happening on the inside of our body. So I don't view that as a bad thing. I think as long as you're spending time noticing, like, really, it's really useful, I think, when you do something, to just be noticing, you know, what is it that you then feel, what happens, and how long does it take for you to go back to the low carb way of being. So there's value in all that. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Lucky last, oats are not recommended if you have diabetes. I thought it was okay to replace bread with oats.
Yeah, I think that oats are overrated. That oats are often, you know, promoted as this better option because it has a lower GI. But GI, I don't think is the best thing to look at, especially if you have type 2 diabetes. So GI is really referring to how long it takes our body to break down those carbohydrates and how quickly it gets into the blood. But, you know, something like a, you know, bowl of oats might have, you know, 4 or 5, you know, teaspoons of sugar in there, whereas actually, you know, some eggs and, you know, some avocado, maybe some mushrooms, all of that food may only have 1 or even less than, you know, 1 teaspoon of sugar. Well, actually, probably less than 1. So this, you know, concept that, you know, there's healthier carbohydrates than others, you know, based on the GI, is a bit of a myth. So what I like to look at more is the GL, so the glycemic load. So that takes into consideration the GI, but also the volume of carbohydrates that the body's getting. So whether you have a big bowl of oats or a small bowl of oats, it's going to have the same GI, but depending on you know, the sizes will take into account the amount of carbohydrates. So there's going to be a very different GL compared the smaller to the larger. So it's really not the GI, it's the total amount of carbohydrates. It's really the GL that's really important. And I always just like simply just go back to, you know, the body only has 1 teaspoon of sugar in there. You know, how many teaspoons are being poured in, you know, by the bowl of oats? You know, you're starting off the day maybe with, you know, 4 or 5, and then there's the milk that might go with the oats, and the low fat coffee that might be there, plus the, you know, the piece of fruit that might be next to it. You know, you're looking at, you know, 15 teaspoons of sugar. So I don't recommend something like oats to the people that I speak to. Generally, a breakfast option would be something like eggs and some bacon, some avocados, some mushrooms, as a breakfast option instead of the oats.
Great, thanks Rob and Camilla. That's all the questions that we had, so well done.
Thank you so much, Rob and Susie. It was great to have everyone here this evening. And of course, if you have any questions, please send us an email, visit us on our website, give us a call. We'd love to hear them and answer them and hear, you know, your story, how you found us and what you got out of this webinar as well. But I'd like to wish everyone a really great evening and hope to see you soon. I'm going to stop the webinar now.